All right. We are welcome. Sorry I'm late. As you can tell, I'm under the weather, and I just thought I'd be a little bit better today. But I am, but I still sound like crap. And this is going to be kind of a hodgepodge. As you can see, sun's kind of out, and there's guys working on the roof, and then I probably have to get my daughter in a little bit. But we'll see what we can do. The third thing about this one is this is I feel rather intimidated by the amount of stuff that there is to talk about this week, specifically the playoffs. Um, I don't even know if we're going to review. Well, I know we won't review a lot of the games last week. We'll probably just hit on the game, but I feel like everyone's just moved past it already. But one of the benefits about doing it today and not yesterday on Tuesday is that we have the college football playoff rankings that we'll talk about as we go into the final week. I think this should be called the final week of the regular season. So anyway, the first thing that we need to talk about is Texas A&M, and I think that we need to call out how ridiculous that program is. Um, the first thing is how much money they spent on Jimbo Fisher, which I think at the time, you know, they needed to land a big fish. Like A&M has little brother syndrome. And I think they got a taste of kind of being the big dog when Johnny Manziel was there and beating Alabama. And they're just trying to get that taste back. And so when they hired Jimbo Fisher, I think they were like, okay, if we write a big enough check, we'll be able to cash it with a good coach. Like this will make everybody happy. He's already got a national title. Um, and in some respect, like it's not like A&M was a bad team. Like I would argue that A&M was competitive every year that Jimbo Fisher was there, not competitive to the extent that they're falling out with Alabama and Georgia. Anyway, like the point is they wanted to be like Alabama and Georgia. They thought they could pay for it. And after blowing out Mississippi State, they were like, "Oh, you're done. We'll buy out you for $77 million, and we'll buy out your staff." I think the total buyout for the entire coaching staff was $110 million. So just thinking about like the amount of money after only like four, I believe it was four losses, that A&M spent to make this go away is absolutely like ridiculous. It really is just kind of like um, mind blowing how much Texas A&M was just ready to see Jimbo go away. Um, and I don't know. I'm pulling up 51-10 was against Mississippi State. They lost to Ole Miss by 3. Um, lost to Tennessee by 7. I mean, these aren't bad teams. They beat Oh, they didn't, I'm sorry. I was like looking at the LSU game. They beat LSU last year, which I think is pretty good. So they got four losses. Um, I think just the amount of money to be like, okay, go away. We'll risk this on anybody else, and then basically having the news leak out that you're 7-5, not 8-4. So they have five losses. Again, it's not great. Like the teams above them in the SEC West: LSU, Ole Miss, Alabama. Below them, Auburn, Mississippi State, Arkansas. That's about right. I mean, it's hard. It's hard out there in SEC land. But to spend all that money to make him go away and then announce that you have Mark Stoops, who's a good coach, and then get vetoed on that is absolutely like there's a great story that about ironically with Texas. and in the way that I forget who told it, but it was basically like Mac Brown in his time at Texas after one of their games, um someone needed to go talk to him on his way to talk to the players. I think it was a reporter, and instead of going into the locker room, kept going. He's like, "Oh," the reporter asked him like, "Where are you going?" He goes, "I've got to go talk to the boosters." There was like a phone call like waiting for him. So before he even gets to talk to his players, Mac Brown had to talk to the UT boosters. And the same thing with Nick Saban in terms of how like poisonous boosters can be. When he went to Alabama from Miami, from the Miami Dolphins, he pretty much told the athletic director, like, I'm not doing this whole booster thing. Like, you get them out of my way. These people are toxic. I think they're one of the reasons why Texas A&M just ponied up so much money for Jimbo Fisher in the first place because these guys had to go back to their office and their dinner parties in the Hamptons and say, "Oh yeah, we got Jimbo Fisher now. Well, who do you have?" Blah blah blah. Um, and I think like it does a disservice to the staff that Texas A&M already has in place in their athletic department. And it I think another way to put this in my mind that I find like just absolutely ridiculous um, is this is like if the teachers started listening to the parents about how everything should be run in the classroom or in on the roster and who gets a starting job. The problem is that like at some point someone's not going to be happy, right? And the people in charge usually know best. That's why they got hired. And the people on the outside looking in, they're not at practice. Like they're not in the classroom. They're not making the assessments, and yet they're the ones calling the shots. And that's what's going on at Texas A&M. I think they got a good guy. I think Mike Elko. You know, in terms of like the pivot that they made, it was probably I don't know if you want to say the better choice. I mean, he was at Duke for 2 years. Um, but you know, I think Mike Stoops played in the SEC. Like he knows exactly. He's not going to have to go up and find new film, right? Go out and find new film. He knows exactly who he's up against, and now he's got the resources of a Texas A&M and M and not Kentucky. So like you could go either way with the fact that Mike Elko was a defensive coordinator at A&M for a while and knows the culture. And my God, like you need to know the culture going in there. Um, so anyway, I think Texas A&M is is basically like constantly fulfilling the stereotype of being the little brother tryhard who doesn't get what they want and constantly throws a fit and just can't seem to get out of their own damn way. And until they let people in the building like call the shots and do what needs to be done, it's going to be third in the SEC West or however the SEC is going to put their divisions if they're going to have them in the next few years. They're not going to be where they need to be because I guarantee goddamn Kirby Smart like in Georgia is not asking like, "Hey, who do you guys want to be recruited?" Um, we'll listen to the boosters on who we're recruiting. Kirby Smart's going in there and be like, "By the way, I've won national titles with Nick Saban. This is who we're going out and getting." I think the other thing that is always sad for me is like Jonathan Smith leaving Oregon State to go to Michigan State. I totally get it because who knows what you know. Oregon State is left behind on an island with Washington State as everyone else bails the Pac-12. So he doesn't know what the water is going to be like in the next few years. So I don't blame him for leaving. But also, man, Michigan State in general, be it with Larry Nasser or the situation with Mel Tucker, like you're going into, you know, I don't want to say it's the same thing as Texas A&M. It's not, but an athletic department that's had its issues. And I always hate seeing coaches leave programs that they helped create that would not have been put like Duke with Elko and Oregon State with Jonathan Smith, um, that they helped build and fail and go to like a bigger program. I don't even know if I mean, I do know Michigan State is a step up, but I don't think they're the only reason they're a step up is because everyone knows they're going to be in the Big Ten next year, and no one knows how the Pac-12 is going to pan out. And finally, on the coaching note, I think it's important to look at the idea. A little bias here, but like I really like the fact that Oklahoma, and this is like, putting a bow on it in some sense. like Oklahoma has done a really good job in the football realm of staying like in house um, these past 25 years. Um, in the Blake era, that was in house after Switzer left, and Switzer was an in house hire. The only time they went out was Bob Stoops, and they got him from Florida State. They got him from Florida, sorry. And then from that point on, Bob Stoops passes it on to the offensive coordinator, Lincoln Riley. When Lincoln Riley bailed like the traitor that he is, we went to a former defensive coordinator in Venables. And I think that kind of, do you know the program? Do you know what it means to coach here? Do you know the staff? I mean, when I say staff, like the people in the administrative office, do you know the building? I know it sounds dumb, but like, do you have an inside feel of the program? I think Oklahoma has done a really good job of that. And another organization that has done a really good job of that, again, like I think this is an important part of being successful, is the Pittsburgh Steelers. Like they've had three coaches in like 60 years or something. And I think I can name them: Chuck Noll, Bill Cowher, and Mike Tomlin. That's right, right? Um, that's amazing. Like I'm not even a Steelers fan. And that organization goes 500. They'll have a losing season here or there, but they know the guy. They know what he stands for. The people in the building know each other, and they're all out there for a common goal. And I think that's the problem that A&M has is like 7-5 is not a horrible season, and we're just like they're 6-1 at home. You know, like I pulled up the schedule again. Well, you know, like that's I don't know what they think is going to happen. Is it underwhelming based on what you're paying Jimbo Fisher? Yes, but you're the one who overpaid. You know, you're the one who overpaid. Anyway, so I think that's an interesting juxtaposition in terms of this coaching carousel that's going on in college football that I wanted to touch on because I mean if you guys can look up the press conference, the introductory press conference for Elko, even though he's been at A&M, he looks like, oh my God, what have I gotten myself into when they start singing the fight song. All right. Um, I'm going to briefly touch on just, we'll talk about Ohio State and Michigan really quickly. Um, Great game, phenomenal game. I mean, you know, I do hate, I said it last week, the fact that this game constantly gets put above Oklahoma, Texas in terms of rivalries. But um, when you have teams that are in the top five every year going against each other for a spot in the title game, the conference title game, you know, that then fine, like do it. Um, Oklahoma, Texas hasn't had that for the past few years because the conference has everyone play everyone, and then the best two teams get in. And this was a phenomenal game. I will point out because I've I've been on Michigan for a while that Ohio State never led. The closest it got was 17-17 with 5 minutes left in the third quarter. And I don't think at any point did I feel like Ohio State was going to win this game. Um, and as I talked about in last week's podcast, like I don't think Rob McCord is a great quarterback. I mean, he could argue. I don't even think he's a good quarterback. Honestly, I really don't. And that bared itself out. He had two interceptions. Sorry, two interceptions, and those were the only turnovers of the entire game. And if he doesn't turn the ball over, there's a chance that Ohio State wins that game. So the reason why Ohio State loses is Kyle McCord. And I will say this: the Ohio State defense looks amazing, like absolutely amazing defense. And that's, I think, why Ohio State has gotten as far as they have this entire season is that defense is absolutely phenomenal. And to credit Michigan, I think they knew that Ohio State was going to give them the kitchen sink, and those fourth down calls, three fourth down plays, one of them in the red zone to keep the ball and momentum going, I thought was absolutely phenomenal coaching. And all those calls were great calls. And I think that's one of the things too that with the Harbaugh situation is the irony that they're probably better prepared from a play calling perspective than Ohio State because they have to be ready for certain scenarios, and they were ready to be aggressive because their head coach was not on the sideline that day. Um, I think they're I think they're the best team in the country. I really do. I know we talk about Georgia, and I don't think Georgia has played anybody amazing. I mean, they played Missouri. Um, they played Ole Miss, and they killed them. So I mean, I take that back a little bit, but Michigan just constantly impresses me. They Ohio State even outgained Michigan 378 yards to 338. Um, but Michigan owned the time of possession, and they just did a phenomenal job. The only other thing I'll touch on, um, I won't talk about Florida State. I'll save the Florida State talk for the rankings. And I was not impressed with that game. That was kind of a boring game. So if you want to watch highlights, you can. Um, we hit both of our best bets, and it wasn't even close. Arizona was a 12.5 point favorite. They won 59-23. And if you listen to the podcast, I picked Mizzou to cover 7 points against Arkansas. That was 48-14. So that was pretty exciting. And we also called Michigan's win. So um, that was great. Things are going well in terms of like I feel good and that like, hey, I'm not a complete moron when we were like getting walloped in best bet. And then so that brings us to very contentious subject matter and what makes college football so amazing. And this is going away, and that's the college football playoffs because this is expanding. So let me say my rankings, and you know what? I'll just go top six. No, I'll go top 10. Sorry, I'll go top 10. Michigan is number one. Georgia's number two. That stays the same. With Ohio State's loss, Washington's up to three. Florida State is four. That looks pretty good to me. Big Ten, SEC, Pac 12, ACC. Five is Oregon, six is Ohio State, seven, Texas, eight, Alabama, nine, Missouri, and then 10, Ole Miss. Louisville is out. All right. With playoff committee, that is number one, Georgia. I don't agree with that. Number two, Michigan. Number three, Washington. Number four, Florida State. So it's pretty close. The only difference we really have is Michigan and Ohio State. Five is Oregon, six is Ohio State, seven is Texas, eight is Alabama, nine is Missouri, 10 is Penn State. The only difference is we have Ole Miss and Penn State switch. So for the most part, like I put my rankings out on Sunday, um, just to make sure I get ahead of the AP and the coaches. I pretty much agree. I'm with the majority of the top 10. Now, here is the problem. Excuse me. Number one, I this is expanding next year. I'm trying to figure out how I want to cut this. Let's start with this. This is expanding next year to 12 teams, which is stupid because I don't even think there should be four teams in the playoffs. I think it should be three. So, for example, let's say Georgia, Michigan, Oregon, and Florida State win, then I would have Michigan and Oregon because I'd put Florida State out of there. I'd move Oregon into the three spot because they beat Washington. Florida State would not have enough um, like crucial victories. Like I mean, they've got LSU, but the Louisville win is not going to help them. And I think the Pac-12 is a better conference. So the top three would be let's just keep with um, the playoff rankings. Have playoff is Georgia, Michigan, Georgia one, Michigan two, Oregon three. I would have Michigan and Oregon play for a shot to play Georgia. That's it. That's it. No one else. No one needs to play. No one, that is all we need. Because then we start watering down these conference title games, and it's getting to the point where the conference title games don't really matter, and we get into these crazy scenarios where, for example, let's say The chaos really is if Alabama, who's ranked eighth, wins. So if Alabama beats Georgia, what does that mean? That is a huge question. Um, I and here's the problem: you can't have Alabama go in without Texas going in. You can't because Texas beat Alabama earlier in the season, and if UT wins their conference title game, then they'll have one loss, and Alabama will have one loss, and Georgia will have one loss, and Washington and Oregon will have one loss. So again, you know, why are we just putting it down to three teams? Because then you bump Michigan up to one, you bump Oregon up to three, and then Florida State up to two if they win. There's two teams that are undefeated, and then um, you have Oregon who has avenged their loss against Washington on a neutral field at three, and then you'd play Florida State, Oregon. You see what I'm saying? Like that makes a lot of sense to me. I don't understand it. Here's another thing. There's a scenario where Ohio State gets in, right? If Texas loses and Florida State loses and Georgia wins, then Ohio State could be back in. And then, they sit at home on their couch and Michigan plays another game just for Ohio State to get in 2 weeks after Michigan beat them. See, like it doesn't make any sense. So the playoffs are already too many teams. It's only happened once where four has beaten one, and that was the first year with Ohio State. And Ohio State went on to win. The other thing is if these games and these teams, excuse me, were set up like it's going to be next year with 12, here's the first round of games. Okay. Um, Ohio State versus Tulane, 5 versus 12 in Columbus. Oregon versus Penn State in Eugene. Texas versus Ole Miss in Austin. And Alabama, Missouri in Tuscaloosa. None of those games appeal to me at all. Like, at all. None of those games appeal to me at all. Number one, Alabama hasn't played Missouri this year, but that's an SEC team. Again, like, Alabama, in theory, could lose the SEC title game, right? Because we're still going to have conference title games. And then play Missouri. I doubt they move because they're not going to move a spot. They're not going to move below Missouri, would they? For Penn State, like by playing an extra game and losing to Georgia, right? I don't. Okay, just bear with me. Alabama plays Missouri, SEC, SEC title doesn't matter. You're still gonna go in the playoffs. You don't win your conference game because here's the other problem: if Alabama beats Missouri, guess who they play again in the next round? Georgia, because Georgia's number one. Number one seed plays the lowest seed. So if all the higher seeds beat like Tulane, Penn State, Ole Miss, then you have a rematch of the SEC title game. So what are we doing? So this is next year's. If next year's playoff scenario played out, then Alabama and Georgia would play twice. Which for some people they're like, that's great. But again, one of the beauties of college football is like you play them once and it's for all the marbles. Ohio State Tulane. Does anyone after the Michigan Ohio State game want to see Ohio State play Tulane in Columbus? I don't. So if all those teams, the favorites win, the next round is Georgia, Alabama, Michigan, Texas, Washington, Oregon. Again, they would have just played in the Pac-12 title game. And one of the things we talked about it the other week, like they these rankings would probably change a bit after the title. But again, this is like an why are the best teams playing an unnecessary game while other teams get to sit at home on the couch? And then the final four, if all the favorites win, were Georgia, Florida State, Michigan, Washington. And I think that kind of sums it up where Georgia, Michigan should be in no matter what. The winner of the Pac-12 title game between Oregon and Washington is in. And then if Florida State loses, then Texas is in because they won their title game, right? That's simple. But none of these teams, it should be Georgia, Michigan, and the winner of the Pac-12. If Georgia and Michigan wins, anyway, um, it's going to be really disappointing to see how watered down all this will be in the future. I had something that I constantly tell my friends where it's about like it should just be the conference title game, and I kind of drew that out so that the conference title games, Conference USA, AAC, American, I'm blanking on it, the American something conference, the American conference. Oh my God, I feel like a freaking moron. Um, American Athletic Conference. God. Um, the MAC, the Sun Belt, the Mountain West, Pac-12, Big 12, ACC, Big 10, SEC. You take all the winners of those games and you give buys to the first few teams: Georgia, Michigan, Washington, Florida State. The first round would be Liberty. Did I do this right? Liberty versus UGA, UNLV versus Michigan, Toledo versus Oregon, Troy versus Florida State, Tulane versus Texas. And again, I'm like, that wouldn't work because I don't like want to. Nothing about that seems appealing. Like these these teams are not good enough from top to bottom. This isn't like the NFL where you can get a wild card team and they can still compete with like the top team in the league or the second and the third. College football is really like three teams, maybe four, that put together a resume that shows that they're some of the best in the country. You have some teams that are close, but again, like Alabama lost to Texas, Texas lost to OU, Ohio State lost to Michigan. Like why would they have another shot? You know what I'm saying? Like why? I don't understand why they would have another shot. I mean, it doesn't make much sense to me. So anyway, that is um that is kind of how I feel about the college football playoffs. If the real question is again going back to Alabama, if Alabama wins, I put and Texas wins because you have to put them in together. I would put Michigan in. If Oregon wins, I'd put Oregon in, and then I would put Texas in because I would say the SEC team, Bama knocks out Georgia with one loss. So it's Michigan 1, Oregon 2, Florida State 3, Texas 4. That's what I would do. But no one wants that because the SEC's got to be the best conference ever. But I think those two teams would knock themselves out. Um, because and the other thing that I'll say too is like I'm sorry for I live by an airport, so if you hear buzzing, that's Florida State should not be penalized for losing their starting quarterback. Um, in the same way that Ohio State was not penalized for losing their starting quarterback. Um, like you win the games, you do what's asked of you, and that's Jordan Travis is, a phenomenal player, and they haven't lost the game yet. So, like, you can't just be like, "Oh, you're not as good as you were." We don't have a big enough resume to say that they're bad. I don't think they played well against Florida. Uh, That was also in the swamp. Who knows how Jordan Travis would have? We don't know how Jordan Travis would have played. So that's a really frustrating thing to hear. For example, if Alabama beats Georgia, that both Georgia and Alabama would need to be in, and Florida State would be knocked out. Again, you can't put Alabama in over Texas if Texas wins their game because Texas beat Alabama in Tuscaloosa. So Georgia's got to go, and yeah, there's no way. There's no way to put Michigan, the winner of the Pac-12, because the winner of the Pac-12 has to be in, and keep Florida State out if they win. And that's why I would have both Georgia and Alabama out because Florida State's undefeated. You're going to put Florida State in the back of the class if Georgia's got one loss, Texas has one loss, Alabama has one loss, and Florida State won their conference and is undefeated. You can't do that. Anyway, those are my thoughts on the title games. Let's get to the primer this week. If you are tired of me talking about Georgia and Alabama, well, I've got one more thing. Georgia is my best bet. They are 5-point favorites. That may have moved to 6. Um, that Alabama Auburn game was ridiculous. And like, let me just use this line. Those of you who don't know, like, Auburn was up on Alabama most of the game. Alabama won on a fourth down and long, basically fourth and goal. But like, it was a 30-yard throw. Um, and they won. They won in miraculous fashion on the road against a team that just a week before lost to New Mexico State. Like, not a good team. Um, and I just hate Paul Feinbaum so much because he loves, I mean, he's obviously an SEC homer. He grew up covering or got his bona fides covering Alabama football in the 90s and the 2000s. His excuse was Auburn didn't play New Mexico State well because the players didn't care. Okay, cool. That means you're a bad football team. That's not an excuse as to why they lost one week and almost won against Alabama the next week. I would argue that Alabama is just not a great football team. That seems like a pretty tight argument. But because they've got Nick Saban on the sidelines and one of the best rosters in the country, we're going to argue it the other way. Like, that's a team that got their butt handed to them for fourth quarters and won on a miracle play. Alabama is not as good as everyone thinks they are. Georgia is every bit as good as people say they are. This game is in Atlanta, and Georgia being only a 5-point favorite is Bama bias at its finest. So take Georgia to cover. Um, Looking at the Big Ten, I have this game as my best backyard brawl. Um, this one shouldn't be that great. My only interest in this one is like how much is Michigan just burnt out from that Ohio State game and the coaching carousel and everything that's gone into the season. Um, and losing their like all conference. I'm not sure like if we want to say all pro, but like one of the best guards in the country with Zach Sinter going down for the season. Um, if that's just going to get to them at all, or if they just are just grinding it out. The spread is 23. And 2 years ago, the Wolverines, with probably an inferior team to this one, beat Iowa 42-3 in the Big Ten title game. And they beat Purdue last year 43-22. So they should be able to do that again. There's my roof, guys, if you can hear that. Again, we're just trying to make it through the season. So apologies. Um, since here's an interesting stat too, and it stinks that the Big Ten is going to lose their divisions because you will have a scenario just like we talked about with the playoffs, where Ohio State, Michigan will play, and then they'll just see each other again in the playoffs. So the game will lose its muster a little bit. Since the Big Ten went to East-West alignment in 2014, where the East team and the winner of the East and the winner of the West plays in the Big Ten title game, no West team has won the championship game. So you either have Penn State, Ohio State, or Michigan winning, which is absolutely insane. Um, And it'll be interesting to see if I'm sorry, Iowa State, Iowa can defensively hold Michigan, uh, because that defense is good. But again, I think Ohio State has a defense just as elite as Iowa, and so that should be pretty good. And by the way, the matchup predictor from ESPN says 92% chance Michigan. Um, the most intriguing matchup again is Bama Georgia because this is what Nick Saban does. And Kirby Smart, Georgia's coach, is Nick Saban's protege, and I I'm not going to say he can't pull it off. I just don't think Justin Milroe is the guy who's going to make it happen. Sorry, Jalen Milroe, not Justin. My boy Justin is a Alabama guy, so Jalen Milroe. Um, let me give you an example of kind of why I like the score lines. Like we look at Alabama versus Auburn, we see that Alabama won. Um, you look at the score line against Georgia Tech, who Georgia played last week. The final score line was 31-23. Oh my God, 8 point game. That was going to the fourth quarter, 31-13. Like that was not Georgia. Georgia was dominating. Um, Bama's competition this year is just so mid. They lose to Texas. They played South Florida, Ole Miss at home in Tuscaloosa. They beat them. At Mississippi State, not great. At A&M, and by the way, that A&M game was 26-20. Arkansas, who's horrible, in Tuscaloosa, 24-21. Tennessee, 34-20. LSU, they knocked out the best player in the country, and so that was probably not a fair fight. Um, with Jaden Daniels, I keep blanking on people's names. Um, and that game was like back and forth until the third quarter. And then you round it out with Kentucky, Chattanooga, and Auburn. Again, I don't this spread that we've got here. I don't think is very reflective of how not great Alabama is. The matchup predictor, interestingly, has Georgia with only a 52% chance of winning, which I found interesting because, like, if you look at this, well, we'll talk about the Oregon game coming up, but it's very different with the Oregon Washington. Against three ranked teams this season, Georgia's averaged 40 points per game and allowed an average of 16 points on defense. That's pretty good. Um, Georgia ranks eighth in scoring offense. Alabama ranks 17th in scoring offense. Georgia has the sixth best scoring defense in the country, and Alabama has the 14th. Um, I mean, I think all those things say it right there. Where I don't think Georgia's played anyone that great either. I mean, Missouri I think is really good, and that was a close game. I mean, Missouri is basically a top 10 team, but I don't. If Bama pulls this off, man, like people are going to lose their minds. People are going to lose. The playoff committee is going to lose their shirts if Alabama wins this game. Because in some sense, it means that Georgia should probably be in. I don't know why, but it's so hard to like pull Georgia out, especially if it's a close game. Georgia, Alabama, and Texas all have to be in. Or at the very least, Texas and Alabama have to be in. And then you're leaving Georgia out, you're probably leaving Florida State out, and you're putting in Michigan in the winner of Pac-12. So anyway, that'll be very, very interesting. And then our game of the week is Friday, and that is Oregon versus Washington in Las Vegas, which should be it's kind of an interesting place to play a Pacific Coast game. There's nothing about uh, let's say I know UNLV is back, but they're not a Pac-12 team. They're Mountain West. Um, Oregon's been on a tear since they lost Washington in Seattle. Um, there's some pretty interesting stats here. Number one, Oregon's favored by almost 10 points, which I think is really kind of crazy, considering the fact that Washington did beat them earlier in the season, and Washington hasn't lost a game yet, and that this is a neutral site. I don't. I think that would, for me, I'd feel more comfortable at like a 4.5 point favorite for Oregon. But here's like why. I mean, the Ducks have scored. Excuse me. The Ducks have scored at least 30 points and won by double digits in every contest since they've lost to Washington. Um, Bo Nix has had four straight 360-yard passing performances and has thrown 16 touchdowns in the past six games. The Ducks are number one nationally in passing production, second in scoring, and seventh in scoring defense since losing to Washington. So they're like destroying teams, like absolutely destroying teams. Washington is on the other side of that coin. After that really big win, they have not had a double-digit win since September 23rd, and they've won their last two games by combined 5 points. The ESPN matchup predictor gives Oregon a 76% chance to win this game, which is insane when you compare it to the Georgia situation. But that I think that's going to be the best game. I mean, it's going to be really interesting to see if I'm sorry, not Georgia, Oregon. If Oregon can come out in Las Vegas against, I mean, we got two Heisman contenders in Bo Nix and Michael Penix Jr. And if they can beat Washington, um, and avenge that loss earlier in the year to basically seal a spot in the college football playoffs, because everything on paper says they're one of the better teams in the country. Um, so that's it. I mean, if I just to kind of wrap up here and how I think things will go on Tuesday, I think Florida State has to be in if they win. Like they have to be in. I don't care about the quarterback situation. I think they've got to be in. Excuse me, if they win. Um, Winner of the Pac-12 has got to be in. It's two spots. Michigan will be in, and Georgia. So Georgia 1, Michigan 2, Oregon 3, and Florida State 4, which will make for a horrible 1-4 game, Georgia versus Florida State. That's going to be so bad. And then Michigan versus Oregon is going to be pretty dang good. It's going to be a great game. So, we're gonna do a bowl pick'em. I'm pretty pumped about that. We'll talk about the playoff rankings, and I will try to not sound like absolute butt. But yeah, please tune in next week. Hopefully, I can win you money in your bowl pick'em pool for the holiday, and that may be it. Every week, I'm like, are we gonna do? We'll have one more for sure with the bowls. I don't know if I've got enough in me to talk about the playoffs as they come up, but we'll see what we can do. Either way, thanks again for listening. Talk to you later.